The August sun beat down mercilessly as Marcus Johnson, a 45-year-old widower and the only black man who owned farmland in Riverdale County, stood at the back of the crowd with his fists clenched. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes burned with quiet fury at the scene unfolding before him. On the makeshift platform in the town square, a young woman stood with her eyes fixed on the ground. Her trembling hands clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders despite the heat. Her parents, hollow-eyed and desperate, stood nearby with expressions that mixed shame with grim determination. "Final item of today's debt settlement," announced Sheriff Taylor, his voice carrying across the square. "Labor contract for Emma Wilson, age 19, healthy, literate, good with figures. 5-year contract to cover the Wilson family's outstanding debts. Bidding starts at $15. Marcus knew what this was. A thinly disguised human sale hiding behind the veneer of a labor contract. Such arrangements had become increasingly common in 1887, especially in struggling rural communities, where the law turned a blind eye to practices that echoed the not-so-distant past. $20, called out James Harmon, owner of the local saloon. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he assessed Emma like merchandise. $25, countered William Porter, a landowner known for working his farm hands until they collapsed. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. The drought had devastated his small farm, and the $50 in his pocket was meant for seeds for the next planting season. It was his last hope to save the land he had worked so hard to acquire after his wife, Catherine's death 3 years ago. The young woman on the platform looked up for the first time, her eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of fear and resignation. For a moment, her gaze met Marcus's, and something in her expression, not quite hope, but a flicker of dignity refusing to be extinguished, struck him to his core. $50, Marcus's deep voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Silence fell over the square. Dozens of faces turned simultaneously in his direction, expressions of shock and indignation barely contained. Emma's father narrowed his eyes, his mouth twisted in a mixture of contempt and avarice. "I won't give my daughter to Mr. Wilson began. $50 in gold, Marcus interrupted, stepping closer to the center. "Cash, right now." Sheriff Taylor cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think." "The announcement said any property owner with means can bid," Marcus said evenly, "unless the law applies differently today?" The sheriff's face flushed, but he knew Marcus was right. These contract auctions operated in a legal gray area, and challenging Marcus's right to bid might attract unwanted attention from federal authorities. $50 once, the sheriff announced reluctantly. Harmon and Porter exchanged glances, but no one else bid. The town's wealthier residents weren't willing to pay more than that for a labor contract, and the poorer ones couldn't afford to enter the bidding at all. "Sold," the sheriff declared, banging his small gavel. The square erupted in indignant murmurs as Marcus approached to finalize the payment. As he counted out the gold coins, flashes of memory assaulted him. Catherine being refused service in the same square years ago. The simple grave where she had been laid to rest, victim of a fever that no local doctor had been willing to treat. The suffocating loneliness of his cabin since then. The son who had moved north, unable to bear the hostility of the town any longer. Emma stepped down from the platform with hesitant steps. Up close, Marcus could see the evidence of hardship in her thin frame and the shadows under her eyes. She kept her gaze lowered, as if she had learned that looking up meant punishment. "What's your full name?" he asked, keeping a respectful distance. "Emma Wilson," she replied in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Marcus Johnson," he said. "My farm is about 4 miles outside town." "I know who you are," she replied, surprising him. Everyone does. As they began to walk away from the square, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Good God, they sold the girl to a black man. This won't end well. Someone should do something. Marcus felt the weight of hostile glances like physical blows. Emma walked a step behind him, as if she had been trained to do so. As they passed the saloon, James Harmon spat on the ground. $50 is a high price for something you won't be able to keep for long, Johnson, he taunted, loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcus didn't respond. He continued walking toward the wagon parked at the edge of town, where his old horse waited patiently. As he helped Emma climb up, He noticed that she was trembling, not from fear of him specifically, but from something worse. The expectation of what was to come based on everything she had already endured. "I won't hurt you," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "You have my word." For the first time, she looked him directly in the eye. His eyes reflected not only pain, but a spark of something Marcus recognized immediately. The same quiet determination that had kept him alive in a world that wanted him dead. "Why?" she asked simply. Marcus didn't answer right away. He started the wagon before saying, "Because I know what it's like to be treated like property." As the wagon pulled away from the town under the hostile gaze of the residents, no one noticed the small journal Emma kept hidden in the folds of her skirt, nor the brief glance she exchanged with a figure watching from the shadows. There was much more to this silent young woman than anyone in Riverdale could have imagined, something that would forever change the fate of the county. Marcus's farm was 4 miles from town, isolated among parched fields and a small oak grove. By the time they arrived, the sun had begun to set, painting the landscape in long shadows. Emma silently surveyed the property. The modest but well-maintained house, the small barn, the stone well surrounded by a garden struggling against the drought. "This is it," Marcus said, climbing down from the wagon. "It's not much, but it's mine. No one will bother you here." Emma remained motionless on the wagon, her eyes calculating distances, assessing the surroundings like someone accustomed to planning escapes. When she finally got down, she kept several steps away from him. "There's a room in the back," Marcus explained. "It was my son's. It has a lock on the inside." The mention of a son made Emma frown. "Your son?" "David moved to Chicago last year," Marcus replied. "He's working at a newspaper there." Inside the cabin, a lamp was already lit on the central table, a sign that someone had been there recently. Emma noticed the detail, her posture instantly stiffening. "Wait here," Marcus said, noticing her tension. He quickly inspected the house before relaxing. "Martha was here. She left food." At the name, Emma reacted. "Martha Jenkins, the midwife?" Marcus nodded, surprised. "You know her?" "She helped my mother once," Emma replied evasively. The cabin was simple but organized with meticulous precision. Books lined perfectly on makeshift shelves. A cedar table darkened by time but polished to a shine. This wasn't the chaotic environment of a defeated man. It was the disciplined refuge of someone who refused to give up. "You plan to run tonight, don't you?" Marcus asked calmly during dinner. Emma froze, her body tense. "I don't blame you," he continued, "but there are men patrolling the eastern road, bounty hunters hired by Harmon to catch runaways. The western route crosses Porter's land." "I'm not a slave," Emma retorted. "No, you're not," Marcus agreed. "But try explaining that to those men in the dark. If you want to leave, I won't stop you, but at least wait until we can arrange safe passage." The next morning, Emma found the house empty and the door unlocked. She was not a prisoner. Through the window, she saw Marcus working in the parched garden, trying to revive dying plants with water from the well. While searching the house for money or valuables, Emma found something unexpected. A book of state laws marked in several places with meticulous notes. Next to it were letters signed by a Professor Williams from Howard University. Before she could investigate further, she heard horses approaching. 3 horsemen rode onto the property. Emma recognized James Harmon, accompanied by William Porter, and a third man who was elegantly dressed and wore an expression of calculated friendliness. Marcus dropped his hoe and walked toward them, standing tall, his face impassive. "Johnson," Harmon said with false cordiality, "we've come to introduce Mr. Davis, the new county assessor." The tall man bowed his head in a greeting that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Johnson, I've heard a great deal about you. We're conducting property inspections to update the county records." "My taxes are paid," Marcus replied. "They always are." "It's not about taxes," Porter interjected with a malicious smile. "It's about land utilization. Unproductive land may be reassessed for more efficient use," Davis elaborated. Emma watched from the window as Marcus's jaw tightened, though his expression remained neutral. "This property has been registered in my name since 1872 with all the proper documents." "Times change, Johnson," Harmon laughed. "Regulations change." When the men finally left, Emma confronted Marcus. "They want your land." "They always have," he replied, returning to his work as if nothing had happened. "Why?" It's struggling in the drought like everyone else's. Marcus hesitated. Because there's something here that's worth more than a few acres of dry land. That afternoon, Martha Jenkins arrived in her covered wagon. She was a middle-aged black woman with a formidable bearing and piercing eyes. She brought supplies, dried herbs, and news. The new assessor visited 5 properties today, she reported as she shared tea with them, all belonging to colored folks or immigrants. Marcus nodded as if merely confirming his suspicions. And this? Martha handed him a sealed envelope. Arrived today at the telegraph office. Benjamin asked me to deliver it discreetly. As Marcus read, his expression changed to one of quiet determination. Emma, he called, I need to know exactly what you heard at your father's meetings with Harmon and Judge Preston. The shock on Emma's face was momentary. How do you know about that? You're not the first young person we've helped escape that family, Martha interjected gently. It was then that Emma understood. Marcus hadn't bought a labor contract out of random compassion. The journal hidden in her skirt, filled with dates, figures, and names, suddenly seemed infinitely heavier. My father keeps ledgers, she finally revealed. Payment records, names, dates. Harmon and Judge Preston are organizing something big, something involving the Railroad Land Commission and properties along the river. Marcus and Martha exchanged glances. Is that why your parents were willing to auction your contract so publicly? Martha asked softly. Emma nodded, the first tear finally escaping. I've heard too much, I've seen too much, and I kept records of everything. In town, rumors ran like wildfire about the black man who dared to buy a white girl's contract, about suspicious nighttime visitors to his property, about the proximity of the railroad line that would connect the county to the newly discovered coal deposits. No one noticed the ledger missing from Mr. Wilson's house, or the coded messages sent by telegraph late at night. What the powerful men of Riverdale didn't know was that sometimes those considered invisible are the ones who see most clearly. And that true justice begins not with shouts, but with whispers in the shadows and plans woven by hands that have nothing left to lose, only a future to claim. For days after the assessor's visit, an unexpected storm broke over Riverdale. No one noticed the small figure moving around the back of the courthouse during the chaos, a dark cloak protecting her from prying eyes. Emma Wilson, whom everyone assumed was confined as Marcus Johnson's contract laborer, had infiltrated the heart of local power. Meanwhile, Marcus entered the telegraph office completely soaked. Benjamin, the operator with quiet sympathies for the marginalized, merely nodded. The wire is open to Washington, he said quietly, leaving Marcus alone with the machine. The next morning, the sun shone mercilessly. Harmon, Judge Preston, and 3 wealthy landowners gathered at the saloon, visibly tense. What do you mean disappeared? Hissed the judge, pale as a ghost. Documents don't just disappear. The safe was locked, replied Harmon, nervously tugging at his collar. No one but you has the key. What neither of them knew was that at that very moment, 6 copies of the stolen documents were being posted at the entrances to the church, the general store, and the courthouse. Evidence of a conspiracy to manipulate land values before the official announcement of the railroad. A scheme that had already forced dozens of families off their land through fraudulent assessments and rigged auctions. When the church bells rang noon, a special train arrived at the small station. 3 men in impeccable suits stepped off, a representative of the Eastern Railroad Company, a federal marshal from the Department of Justice, and a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. They were greeted by Marcus, who led them down Main Street, where a crowd was already gathering around the posted documents. The buzz grew as ordinary citizens discovered the magnitude of the corruption documented in Wilson's ledgers, how Harmon, Judge Preston, and the former sheriff had systematically targeted properties, particularly those owned by black citizens and immigrants, creating false debts and forcing families into contract auctions that were nothing more than thinly veiled human trafficking. It's a forgery, shouted Judge Preston, appearing at the courthouse steps. Fabricated lies. Including your signature on every page, Judge? Asked the federal marshal politely. Or perhaps the map detailing how you intended to manipulate the original railroad route to benefit illegally acquired land is forged as well? Porter tried to escape through an alley only to find Sheriff Taylor blocking his way. Did you know? reporter asked incredulously. "Not everything," replied the sheriff, "but enough to know I couldn't stop what's happening today." The crowd was growing. Faces that would normally have looked away from Marcus now stared at him with a mixture of shock and reluctant respect. But the real surprise came when Emma emerged from the church, accompanied by Reverend Thornton. "This young woman," announced the Reverend, "at great personal risk, has provided crucial evidence of crimes that affect every citizen of this county." Emma stood tall, her eyes meeting the furious gaze of her father, who had just arrived. "You," Wilson growled, lunging toward her. "I wouldn't do that," the federal marshal interjected. "Your daughter has already provided us with enough details about how you, Harmon, and Judge Preston have forced at least 12 families into fraudulent debt contracts over the past 3 years." A telegram was delivered publicly to Judge Preston. "The Bar Association has a keen interest in discovering how a man expelled for judicial misconduct in Virginia is now serving as a judge in another state," the reporter noted dryly. "You can't do this," Harmon hissed, looking frantically around. "This town belongs to me." "Belonged," corrected the railroad representative. "The Eastern Company is particularly interested in finding out how our confidential plans were leaked prematurely and manipulated for personal gain." The chaos that ensued was meticulously documented. The judge's failed escape attempt, Harmon's desperate accusations against his co-conspirators, Wilson's angry cries as officers confiscated additional ledgers from his home. The most extraordinary moment came when Emma confronted her father publicly. "You sold me," she declared without flinching, "as if I were less than human, just as you sold the dignity of this town." Wilson, cornered, revealed the extent of his cruelty. "What did you expect? Your mother couldn't bear to look at you after she realized what a disappointment you were. You were never worth the sacrifices we made." The silence that followed was broken by Marcus's calm voice. "Every person standing in this square is worth exactly the same, Mr. Wilson. This is the truth you tried to bury, that there is no price that can be placed on human dignity." As the conspirators were taken into custody, the turmoil only grew. Some demanded immediate justice. Others, including some who would once have despised Marcus, now sought to associate themselves with a moral victory. Few noticed the quiet conversation between the railroad representative and Marcus, or how the federal marshal carefully examined the property records that had been manipulated. No one noticed the glance exchange between Martha and Emma when the reporter asked to interview them about the underground network that had been quietly helping victims of the contract auction system for years. The town had been shaken to its foundations, but one question remained in the air, whispered in the corners of the square as the crowd dispersed. How had a black farmer and a young woman who had been sold managed not only to survive but to defeat the powerful men who had controlled every aspect of that society? The answer was written in the posted documents, in the letters exchanged with Washington, and in the plan that had begun long before the auction, a plan whose seeds had been planted years earlier when a university professor met a former slave, determined to change the world one injustice at a time. 6 months after the day that changed Riverdale forever, the sun rose over a transformed community. The railroad station, once just a project used for manipulation, now stood real and imposing at the edge of town, providing jobs and economic opportunities for families who had nearly lost everything. Marcus Johnson's modest farm, far from being confiscated, had become the site of a new agricultural cooperative where former victims of the contract system now worked as equal partners, sharing in both the labor and the profits. What began as a makeshift school for 5 children, rejected by the town's educational system, had quickly grown into a proper institution that attracted families from neighboring communities. Emma Wilson, now known throughout the county for her courage, ran the classes with the same quiet determination that had brought down an empire of corruption. "I never imagined I'd be teaching," she remarked one afternoon, watching the 30 students, black, white, and immigrant, under the large oak tree that served as their classroom on warm days. "I was always the girl who could barely lift her eyes when someone spoke to her." Marcus, who was building new desks for the main room, smiled. "I always knew you had fire inside you. You just needed air to breathe." Former Judge Preston was serving time in the state penitentiary, convicted of fraud and conspiracy. Harmon had lost his saloon to creditors and had left the county in disgrace. As for Emma's father, Wilson, public humiliation had led to a decline that turned him into a shadow of the man he once was. "We've received a reply from Professor Williams," Martha announced during the weekly dinner that brought together the core group responsible for transforming the county. Benjamin, the telegraph operator, and Sheriff Taylor, who had finally found the courage to be on the right side of history, completed the group. Williams, the Howard University professor who years earlier had recognized the legal brilliance of a self-taught former slave seeking to understand his rights. The same man who had suggested that Marcus buy that particular piece of land, seemingly worthless, decades before the railroad became a reality. "He secured 10 scholarships for young people from our school," Martha continued. 10 lives transformed. 10 lives who will transform others, Emma murmured, her hand unconsciously touching the small scar on her wrist, a reminder of a previous life that seemed to belong to someone else. The next day, when the first passenger train officially arrived at Riverdale Station, there was a small ceremony. The new mayor, an honest businessman elected after a special election, spoke words of progress and renewal, but all eyes were on Marcus and Emma, standing quietly to the side. "It's thanks to you," an elderly woman whispered to Emma. The same woman who had looked away when she saw her on the street months earlier. "My grandson got a job at the station. They would never have taken a boy like him before." Her grandson, a young man with a withered arm, waved cheerfully from across the platform, wearing his railroad uniform with pride. "We didn't do it alone," Emma replied, smiling genuinely. "That's what they don't understand about justice." Marcus explained later as they walked back to the farm under the evening sky. "It's not just about punishing the guilty. It's about building something better on the ruins." Emma stopped, looking back at the town stretching out below them, lights beginning to flicker in the windows. "When I was on that platform being sold like property, all I wanted was revenge," she confessed. "I wanted everyone to suffer like I did." Marcus nodded, understanding. "And now?" "Now I understand that true freedom isn't just breaking chains. It's creating a world where chains are unthinkable." She looked at the man who had risked everything for her, not out of pity, but out of principle. "They tried to convince us that we were worthless, that I was just a commodity and you were just an intruder on this land. And we ended up proving that our value was never for sale," Marcus added quietly. On the horizon, the towers of the new train station stood out against the twilight sky, a symbol of an economy that now benefited everyone, not just the powerful. In the schoolhouse, maps and books promised futures that had been unimaginable just a few months earlier. Neither of them could have predicted how that desperate act in a dusty square, a black man buying a young woman's labor contract, would become the catalyst that would not only expose entrenched corruption, but also ignite a transformation that now illuminated hundreds of lives. The real revolution, Marcus often told his students, is not tearing down walls, but building bridges where there were once only chasms. In a society built on divisions, Marcus and Emma had proven that true human dignity transcends race, class, and circumstance. That when people deemed inferior refused to accept the limitations imposed on them by others, entire communities can be transformed. "They tried to break us," Emma would tell new students on their first day of class. But they forgot that sometimes broken things reflect light in ways that whole things never could. A person's value can never be defined by what others are willing to pay for them, but by how fiercely they fight for what they believe, and by the courage to see the humanity in others when the world is determined to deny it.